This story is a work of fiction inspired by real themes. Names, characters, and events are fictional. The detective who responded to the call that night later said it was the most straightforward scene he had processed in 22 years on the job. A young woman, alone in her apartment, a bottle of pills on the nightstand, and an empty glass of water. A handwritten note, 2 sentences, left on the kitchen counter. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Her phone showed no outgoing calls in the 14 hours before her death. Everything, he said, pointed in one direction. He closed the case in 4 days. What he didn't know, what nobody knew until 11 months later, was that when he was standing in that apartment, writing in his notebook, the man who had killed her was standing less than 6 feet away, watching him work. His name was on the responding officer's own notepad. He had been the one who called 911. To understand what happened to Camille Desjardins, you have to understand what she was afraid of, not what she told people she was afraid of. Not the things she mentioned casually in conversation, heights maybe, or confrontation. The real fear, the one she had been carrying since she was 19 years old and had made the single most consequential mistake of her life. She was afraid of Nate. That was what her closest friend, a woman named Priya Subramaniam, would later tell investigators. Not his full name at first, just Nate. Because that was how Camille always referred to him. Not as her ex-boyfriend. Not as the man she had dated for 2 years in college. Just Nate. Like the name itself was something she didn't want to hold in her mouth too long. Camille Desjardins was 27 years old when she died. She had grown up in Quebec City and moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia at age 18 to study environmental science at Dalhousie University. She was, by all accounts, the kind of person who organized things. Her apartment, her schedule, her friendships. Her colleagues at the Marine Research Institute where she worked described her as methodical, careful, precise. The kind of person who sent follow-up emails, who kept her commitments, who called when she said she was going to call. She had not called Priya in 9 days before Priya drove to her apartment on the evening of March 4th and found the building's front entrance propped open with a brick. That detail, the brick, would matter later. Priya had been texting Camille for almost 2 weeks, getting back short responses at first. Fine, busy, talk soon. Then nothing. Priya knew what nothing meant. Camille had gone quiet like this once before. 4 years earlier, during a period that neither of them discussed in detail with outsiders, but that Priya described to investigators as the worst 6 months of her life, and it wasn't even happening to her. She took the stairs to the 3rd floor, knocked, no answer, knocked again, still nothing. She tried the door. It was unlocked. Camille was on the bed, still dressed. The lamp on the nightstand was on. The bottle, an amber prescription bottle, her name on the label, was lying on its side, empty. Priya called 911 at 9:47 in the evening. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom and waited, and she did not go in, and she did not touch anything. Because Camille had once told her, years ago, something that had never made complete sense until that moment. She had said, if something ever happens to me, don't touch anything, don't move anything, make them look. Priya stood in the doorway, and she waited, and she made them look. The first officer on scene was Constable Derek Yu of the Halifax Regional Police. He arrived at 1:03 p.m., followed 8 minutes later by his partner, Constable Marie-Soleil Bouchard. They found Priya in the hallway outside the apartment, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, her phone face down in her lap. Is anyone else inside? Yu asked her. No, Priya said. She's alone. He went in. He checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the small kitchen. He came back out and called it in as a possible overdose, non-responsive. The paramedics arrived at 10:19. Camille was pronounced dead at 10:34 p.m. Detective Sergeant Lorne Dakarai arrived just after 11. He was a large man, methodical in the way that Camille herself had been methodical, and he had been with the Major Crimes Unit for 12 years. He walked through the apartment slowly. He noted the unlocked door, which was consistent with the decedent being in distress and not thinking clearly, consistent, that is, with a self-inflicted overdose. He noted the note on the kitchen counter. It read, I can't keep running. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger." He noted the empty pill bottle. He noted the glass of water. He noted that there were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, nothing out of place. He spoke briefly to Priya in the hallway. Priya told him about the text messages, about the 9 days of silence, about Camille's history of anxiety and depression, about a difficult period several years ago. She did not mention Nate. She told investigators later that she had been in shock, that she hadn't been thinking clearly, that she hadn't made the connection fast enough. She would spend a long time hating herself for that. Dakarai asked her one more question before he left. Was there anyone who might have wanted to harm Camille? Anyone she'd been in conflict with? Anyone she'd expressed fear of recently? Priya thought about the 9 days of silence. She thought about Camille's message 4 years ago, "If something happens to me, don't touch anything." And she thought about what Camille had told her, just once, about what those 6 months had really been like. "Not that I know of," she said. She told investigators later that she believed it, that in that moment, standing in that hallway with the paramedics moving around inside and the smell of the apartment in her nose, she genuinely believed Camille had done this to herself. Because Camille had been afraid for so long. And fear like that, sustained, years-long fear, it does something to a person. She believed it for 8 months. Nathan Aldrich was 31 years old. He worked as a contractor for a mid-size construction management firm in Halifax. He had relocated there from Fredericton approximately 14 months before Camille's death. That detail. 14 months. The investigators who eventually reopened the case would return to that number again and again. Camille had moved to Halifax at 18 to attend university. She had stayed after graduating, building her life there, her job, her friendships, her apartment on Quinpool Road. She had not, as far as anyone knew, maintained contact with Nathan Aldrich after their relationship ended when she was 21. She had not, as far as anyone knew, been aware that he had moved to the same city. Whether that was true is something that cannot be determined with certainty. What is certain is that Nathan Aldrich had been living in Halifax for 14 months before Camille Desjardins died, and that in those 14 months he had apparently never made contact with her. Not by phone, not by email, not in person, not in ways anyone could prove. He was the one who called 911 because he lived in the apartment directly above hers. He had heard, he said, what he described as a thump at around 9:30 in the evening. He had gone downstairs to check. The door had been unlocked. He had found her. He had called immediately. He had waited in the hallway until the police arrived. Constable Yu's notes from that night describe him as calm and cooperative. He provided his name, his address, his relationship to the decedent. Neighbor, we don't know each other well, and his account of events. He was asked if he had touched anything inside the apartment. He said no. He was thanked for his time. His last name did not appear in Dakarai's case notes. He was listed simply as neighbor, 4th floor. Provided initial 911 call, no further information. Lorne Dakarai closed the case as an apparent suicide on March 8th, 4 days after Camille's body was found. Here is what Priya Subramaniam did over the following 8 months. She went back to work. She attended Camille's memorial service in Quebec City, where Camille's parents, her mother, Sylvie, and her father, Bertrand, were quiet and broken in the way that parents are when something has taken their child in a way that carries a particular kind of shame, a particular kind of silence. She sat in the back of the church and she held a photograph of the two of them from a trip to Prince Edward Island, and she thought about the note on the kitchen counter. I can't keep running. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. She thought about that phrase. Keep running. Running from what? She had known Camille for 8 years. She knew about the anxiety, the depression, the medication, knew about all of it in the way you know about a close friend's ongoing health, which is to say she knew the shape of it without always knowing the details. But she had never heard Camille describe herself as running from anything. That wasn't the word Camille would use. Camille made plans. Camille organized. Camille did not run. She thought about that for 8 months, and then in November, 8 months and 12 days after Camille died, she was in Camille's old apartment. She had volunteered to help Camille's parents clear the last of the belongings that hadn't been collected after the death. Sylvie had asked her, Priya had said yes because she felt she owed it to her. She was going through a box of books and papers from the closet when she found the notebook. It was a small spiral-bound notebook, the kind you'd find at any drugstore, with a grey cover. Camille's name written on the inside front cover in her small, precise handwriting. Priya sat down on the floor of the empty apartment, and she opened it. What she read took her approximately 40 minutes. When she finished, she sat for another 20 minutes without moving. Then she took out her phone and called the Halifax Regional Police non-emergency line and asked to speak to whoever had handled the investigation into the death of Camille Desjardins. She was put on hold for 6 minutes. When Detective Sergeant Lorne Dakarai answered, she said, "I need you to read something." The notebook began 11 months before Camille's death, April of the previous year. The first entry was short, dated April 7th. It read, "Saw him today, outside the institute. He didn't see me, or he pretended not to. I don't know which is worse." The second entry was April 14th. "He drives a grey truck. I've seen it parked on Quinpool 3 times this week, different spots each time. Not in front of the building, a little further down." The entries continued through the spring and into the summer. Some were several paragraphs long, some were a single sentence. Taken together, they described a period of approximately 10 months during which Camille Desjardins documented that she was being followed. That Nathan Aldrich, a man she had not spoken to in 6 years, had moved to her city, had positioned himself in proximity to her life, was watching her. She had not gone to the police. The notebook explained why. She wrote, in an entry dated June 3rd, "I looked up what I would need to prove harassment. I would need documented incidents, witnesses, evidence of communication. I have none of that. He hasn't spoken to me. He hasn't sent messages. He shows up and he watches and then he goes away. How do you prove that? How do you explain to someone that you can feel a person looking at you from across the street?" She had not told Priya. The notebook explained that too. September 18th, "I don't want to involve Priya. If he's watching me, he might be watching who I spend time with. I don't want her near this." She had gone to her doctor, had described anxiety, difficulty sleeping, a sense of being watched. Her doctor had adjusted her medication, had referred her to a therapist. The therapist, working with the information Camille had provided, which did not include Nathan Aldrich's name, because Camille had been afraid that if she said it out loud, it would make it more real, more dangerous, had gently and professionally explored whether the sense of being watched was a symptom of anxiety rather than an external reality. Camille had written about this in the notebook. October 2nd, Dr. Fossey thinks it might be the anxiety. She might be right, but I know the difference between feeling like someone is watching you and knowing that someone is watching you. I know the difference. I've always known the difference. The final entry in the notebook was dated February 28th, 4 days before Camille's body was found. It read, "He left something in my mailbox, a single key, no note. I don't know what it opens. I threw it away. I think he wanted me to know that he has been inside." Detective Sergeant Lorne Dakarai read the notebook in one sitting. He later said that what he experienced in those 45 minutes was something he had not felt in 22 years of police work. It was not exactly guilt. It was not exactly grief. It was something that sat between those two things and had teeth. He reopened the case the following morning. The investigation that followed lasted 9 months and involved the Halifax Regional Police, the RCMP's Behavioral Analysis Unit, and a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Amara Osei Bonsu, who had studied stalking and coercive control for over 15 years and who would later describe Nathan Aldrich's behavior in the notebook, and the behavior investigators subsequently documented. A zone of the most methodically designed campaigns of psychological destruction she had encountered in her career. That phrase, methodically designed, matters, because it speaks to the central question of the investigation, the question that had to be answered before anything else could be established. Had Camille Desjardins taken her own life, or had she been made to? The forensic investigation into Camille's death was thorough in a way that the initial assessment had not been, because the initial assessment had no reason to look for what the reinvestigation was specifically searching for. The first and most significant finding involved a prescription bottle. Camille's medication, an antidepressant prescribed by her doctor, had a standard refill schedule. Investigators obtained her pharmacy records going back 18 months. According to those records, she had refilled her prescription on February 12th. The bottle that was found on her nightstand on the night of her death, the same bottle that had been documented in Dakarai's original case notes, had been prescribed on February 12th and should have contained a 30-day supply. She died on March 4th, 20 days into a 30-day supply. The bottle had been empty. A 30-day supply of that particular medication, taken all at once, at Camille's body weight, was approximately 3 times the dose required for a fatal overdose. The medical examiner's original report had noted the cause of death as acute drug toxicity, consistent with an overdose of the prescribed medication, and had classified the manner of death as probable suicide, given the note, the circumstances, and the absence of any indication of foul play. The amount of medication found in Camille's system was consistent with the amount missing from the bottle. What had not been noted, because there had been no reason to note it, was that the amount of medication was also consistent with a dose that had been administered over the course of several hours in a beverage or food, rather than taken all at once. The difference between a self-administered overdose and an administered one, in terms of the toxicological findings, was extremely difficult to establish in the absence of other evidence. Dr. Reginald Femi Oladipo, the forensic pathologist who reviewed the original examination for the reinvestigation, was careful about what he would and would not say. What he would say was this: the toxicological findings were consistent with either manner of death. What he could not say, and would not say, was that the findings were inconsistent with homicide. That was important. That was, in the language of forensic investigation, as far as the physical evidence would go. The second finding concerned the note. The note on the kitchen counter, "I can't keep running. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger," had been photographed, documented, and treated as evidence in the original investigation. The paper it was written on had been tested for fingerprints. Only Camille's fingerprints had been found. Investigators in the reinvestigation sent the note to a forensic document examiner at the RCMP's National Forensic Laboratory in Ottawa. The examiner's name was Dr. Linnea Takahashi, and she had been analyzing handwriting and questioned documents for 19 years. She was given the note alongside a sample of Camille's known handwriting, documents recovered from her apartment, emails printed from her work account, cards and letters found in her belongings. Dr. Takahashi's report took 3 weeks to produce. It was 62 pages long. Its conclusion occupied a single paragraph. She found several characteristics of the question note that were, in her professional opinion, inconsistent with the known writing samples. The letter formations, the pen pressure, the spacing between words, none of these were definitively disqualifying on their own. Handwriting changes under stress. It changes when someone is under the influence of medication. It changes when someone is dying. She could not say, definitively, that Camille had not written that note. What she could say was that there were sufficient inconsistencies that the note could not be authenticated as being in Camille's natural hand with any degree of confidence. And she noted one specific anomaly that had no ready explanation. In Camille's known writing, the capital letter I, the personal pronoun, had a distinctive curved serif at its base, a small detail, a habit. In the note, the capital I appeared 4 times. In none of those 4 instances did the serif appear. It is the kind of detail that a person might reproduce if they were copying someone's handwriting from a sample. But it is the kind of detail that a person cannot copy if they do not know it is there. Because it is so small, so automatic, so much a part of how a hand has been trained over years to form a single letter. Dr. Takahashi could not say the note was forged. She said, "I cannot confirm it was not." Nathan Aldrich was brought in for questioning on February 14th, 11 months and 10 days after Camille's death. He arrived without a lawyer. This is notable. Most people who are brought in for questioning in homicide reinvestigation arrive with a lawyer. Nathan Aldrich did not. He sat across from Detective Sergeant Dakarai and a second investigator, Detective Corporal Yasmin Haidari of the RCMP, and he was calm. He was cooperative. He answered questions directly. He said he was shocked to hear that the case had been reopened. He said he was sorry for Camille's family. He said that yes, he had known her in college briefly, they had dated for a short time, and yes, he was aware that she had moved to Halifax, and yes, he had been surprised when he'd relocated there for work and realized they were in the same city. But no, he had never contacted her. He had respected her privacy. He thought it would have been uncomfortable for both of them to make contact after so long. "Did you see her in the city, in passing?" Thackeray asked. Aldrich considered this for a moment. "Maybe once or twice, from a distance. I don't think she saw me." "Did you know she lived on Quinpool Road?" "I might have found out at some point. I'm not sure how." "How would you find out something like that?" He looked at Thackeray steadily. "Don't remember." Haidari asked him about the night of March 4th. He gave his account again. He had heard a sound. He had gone downstairs. The door had been unlocked. He had found her. He had called 911 immediately. "Did you touch anything in the apartment?" she asked. "No, not the nightstand, not the glass of water, not the kitchen counter." "No," he said again. There was a pause. "There was a key," Haidari said, "left in her mailbox on or around February 28th. Do you know anything about that?" For the first time in the interview, something changed in Nathan Aldrich's face. It was small, almost imperceptible, a slight tightening around the eyes. "No," he said, "I don't know anything about a key. Here is where the investigation encountered a wall. Everything Priya had found in the notebook, the sightings, the grey truck, the sense of being watched, was documented only in Camille's own words. Camille had made the deliberate decision not to photograph the truck, not to log dates with photographic evidence, not to tell anyone who could corroborate her account. She had been afraid. She had been trying to survive quietly, and in doing so, she had left almost nothing that could be presented in a court of law. The forensic findings were genuinely uncertain. The handwriting analysis was suggestive but inconclusive. The toxicology supported no definitive conclusion. The key had been thrown away. What the investigators had was a dead woman's private journal describing 10 months of fear, and a man who had been present at the scene and whose name appeared in no part of the initial investigation except a single line in a responding officer's notes. Dr. Amara Osei Bonsu, the forensic psychiatrist who had been brought in as a consultant, met with the investigation team in late March. She reviewed everything: the notebook, the interview transcripts, the forensic reports, Nathan Aldrich's background, the history of the relationship as described by mutual acquaintances from their college years. She presented her assessment over the course of an afternoon. She said that the behavior described in the notebook was consistent with a pattern she had studied extensively, what she called terminal surveillance, the endgame of a certain type of obsessive coercive behavior in which the goal is not contact but control, not to possess the person but to occupy their mind, to make them always aware, on some level, that they are being watched, to slowly, methodically erode their sense of safety until the world becomes unbearable. She said that the behavior described was also consistent with a specific and documented escalation pathway. She said that in a small but significant subset of cases she had studied, this escalation did not end in contact or confrontation. It ended in the subject's death, by their own hand or by the perpetrators, in circumstances that were often impossible to disentangle. She said she could not testify to what had happened in Camille Desjardins' apartment on the night of March 4th. She said she could testify to what the 10 months preceding that night looked like and what they meant. "What did they mean?" Haidari asked. Dr. Osei Bonsu was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They mean she knew what was happening to her. She documented it with extraordinary clarity and precision, and she knew no one would believe her until it was too late." She paused. She was right. The case went to the Crown Prosecutor's Office in May. The decision that came back was not one that anyone involved in the investigation was entirely at peace with. The evidence, as it stood, was insufficient to support a charge of homicide. The forensic findings were inconclusive. The documentary evidence was circumstantial. The interview with Aldrich had produced nothing incriminating. What the Crown could support was a charge of criminal harassment, based on the contents of the notebook, corroborated by phone records investigators had subpoenaed that placed Aldrich's cell phone in proximity to locations Camille had mentioned in the journal on multiple documented occasions. The cell phone records. That was what broke it open in the end. Not dramatically. Not in the way that evidence breaks things open in films, where someone slams a folder on a table and everyone in the room understands in an instant. Quietly, methodically. Over the course of 3 weeks of painstaking analysis by a digital forensics unit. Cell tower data is imprecise. It places a device within a range, not at a specific location. But over 10 months, across dozens of dates that Camille had documented in the notebook, saw the grey truck outside the Institute. April 14th, he was on the corner of Morris Street. May 3rd, he stood outside the coffee shop on Spring Garden for 40 minutes. June 22nd. The analysis showed Nathan Aldrich's phone in proximity to those locations on 29 of the 37 dates she had recorded. 29 of 37. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern. Nathan Aldrich was charged with criminal harassment in October. His lawyer, who he had obtained by then, argued that the cell tower data was circumstantial, that the notebook was the account of a woman with documented anxiety and depression, and that the Crown was attempting to build a murder case on the foundation of a circumstantial harassment charge, because the murder case itself didn't exist. He was not wrong about the last part. The trial lasted 11 days. The cell tower analysis was presented in detail by a forensic digital expert. Dr. Osei Bonsu testified. Priya testified. She was on the stand for 3 hours. She described 8 years of friendship. She described the notebook. She described standing in the doorway of that bedroom on the night of March 4th, and what she had felt, and what Camille had told her, years before, make them look. Aldrich's attorney cross-examined her for 90 minutes. At the end of it, he asked her one question. Ms. Subramaniam, you have told this court what you believe happened to Camille Desjardins, but you weren't there. You don't know what happened in that apartment. Isn't that true? Priya looked at him for a long time. No, she said. I wasn't there. She paused. But she was, and she knew. That's why she wrote it down. Nathan Aldrich was convicted of criminal harassment on a Thursday morning in late November. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. No one was ever charged with the death of Camille Desjardins. Lorne Dakarai retired from the Halifax Regional Police 14 months after the trial. He had served 24 years. At his retirement gathering, which was held at a sports bar in Dartmouth that his colleagues had chosen, someone asked him, as people always ask retiring detectives, about the case that stayed with him, the one he took home. He didn't answer right away. He held his glass. He looked at the table. He said, there was a woman. She kept a notebook. She wrote down everything that was happening to her, everything she saw, every detail, because she knew that if she didn't write it down, nobody would believe her. She was methodical about it, careful, clear, 23 pages of evidence that she kept in a box in her closet. He paused. She never showed it to anyone. She never brought it to us. I've thought about that a lot, and I think I understand it now. I think she knew, she understood, that what she had wasn't enough, that what she could document wasn't enough, that the law, the way it works, the way I work, we couldn't help her until after. And she knew that. He set his glass down. The worst part isn't that we didn't find it in time. The worst part is that she knew we wouldn't. She went through 10 months of that knowing that no one was coming. And she still wrote it down. She still documented every single day. Not for herself. She knew it wouldn't save her. She wrote it for whoever came after, to make them understand. He shook his head. She wrote it for us, and we found it 11 months too late. Priya Subramaniam still lives in Halifax. She works at a social services non-profit that supports survivors of stalking and coercive control. She does intake interviews. She is by all accounts very good at it. She keeps a photograph of Camille on her desk. Prince Edward Island, the two of them, squinting into the sun. She was asked once, in an interview she gave for a documentary short about the case, whether she thought justice had been served. She thought about it for a long moment. I think Camille got heard, she said finally. I think she finally got heard. Whether that's justice, I don't know. I think justice would have been someone listening the first time. She looked at the photograph on her desk. She knew how to make herself understood. She always did. She just needed someone to read what she wrote. The apartment on Quinpool Road has been rented 3 times since March of the year Camille died. The current tenants are a graduate student and her roommate. They have lived there for 8 months. Neither of them knew the apartment's history when they moved in. Camille's notebook is currently held as evidence in an archived file at the Halifax Regional Police Headquarters. 23 pages. Precise, clear handwriting. Dates and times and locations. Documented with the care of someone who understood that the only language that might be believed, eventually, was the language of facts. On the inside front cover, her name. On the inside back cover, a single sentence she had written, in different ink, at some point that cannot be dated. Possibly early in the journal, possibly at the very end. It reads, "I am writing this so someone will know." And that is the part that doesn't let go. Not the trial, not the conviction, not the cell tower data that placed a man near a woman who was afraid of him 29 times in 10 months. Not the handwriting analysis. Not the empty prescription bottle. What doesn't let go is this: she knew. She knew with the kind of clarity that comes only from being in it, from living inside a reality that other people cannot see from the outside. She knew that what was happening to her was real. She knew that the people who were supposed to help her would need proof she couldn't give them while she was still alive to give it. She knew that the note on the kitchen counter didn't sound like her. She knew someone might eventually notice the letter I. She wrote it all down. And then she was gone, and the notebook sat in a box in a closet for 11 months while the world continued without her. And when it was finally found, it told a story that was perfectly clear, perfectly documented, perfectly too late. There is a particular kind of darkness in that gap. The gap between what a person knows and what the systems around them are built to believe. Between the truth as someone lives it and the truth as it can be proven. Camille Desjardins spent 10 months inside that gap, alone, writing in a grey notebook that no one would read until she was dead. She filled 23 pages of it. She needed one person to ask, while she was still alive to answer. That is the part that stays. That is where the strange, dark, and mysterious lives, not in the locked doors or the empty bottles or the note that didn't sound like her. In the gap, in the space between what someone knows and what the world is willing to see. And in the question that never fully goes away, how many notebooks are still waiting to be found? This story is a work of fiction inspired by real themes. Names, characters, and events are fictional. If you or someone you know is experiencing stalking, harassment, or coercive control, please contact your local law enforcement or a domestic violence support organization.